On the 11th of December, 1944, within the Eagle's Nest field, Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood pressed against a cold concrete wall, his hands held high in submission. Flanking him were two equally distinguished figures, Field Marshal Walter Model and General Hasso von Manteuffel. These three men, the supreme commanders of the German Western Front, were currently enduring a profound humiliation at the hands of the SS. Stripped of their sidearms and frisked like common delinquents, they watched as their briefcases were violently torn open and ransacked. A heavy, silent rage permeated the room. These were officers of the old Prussian aristocracy who regarded their personal honour as more vital than life itself. Yet here they stood, suffering the indignity of being manhandled by mere political enforcers. Deep inside the bunker, a trembling Adolf Hitler unveiled his grand strategic gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan called for 200,000 German troops to smash through the Ardennes forest and seize the critical port of Antwerp. Hitler promised them that victory was inevitable, dismissing the Americans as undisciplined cowboys and dilettantes who would panic at the first sign of conflict. He insisted they would crumble and flee, mirroring the chaotic retreat at Kesselring Pass 2 years prior. Von Manteuffel remained silent, yet he did not share the Führer's optimism. Having engaged the Americans in combat, he knew they were far from fragile amateurs who would scatter at the first volley. However, the German High Command had fallen victim to another significant misconception. It was a misunderstanding that would only come to light decades later, correcting a narrative that we had been sold for generations, a story largely crafted by the German generals themselves. In their post-war memoirs and interviews, these commanders asserted that they had viewed George Patton with trepidation from the very beginning. They claimed to have meticulously tracked his every maneuver from the sands of North Africa to the beaches of Normandy. They painted him as the singular adversary who haunted their sleep, a compelling tale that flattered American ego while salvaging German pride. Yet when historians finally unsealed the actual daily intelligence logs from 1944 documents penned while the war was still raging, they discovered something startling. The archives were effectively barren. In February of 1944, 4 months prior to D-Day, German intelligence had compiled detailed dossiers on every Allied commander anticipated to lead the invasion. There were comprehensive files on Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Bradley. Omar Bradley's profile was thorough, and Montgomery's was exhaustive. Yet, a file for Patton was non-existent. There was no obsession to be found. There was no fear. Until August of 1944, his name was scarcely mentioned in the dispatches. The German generals had not been monitoring Patton. They had been effectively disregarding him. How then did the man they neglected evolve into the figure they later claimed to fear above all others? Furthermore, if their eyes were not fixed on Patton, upon whom were they actually focusing their attention? The answers emerged from post-war interrogations conducted by American Army historians and the renowned British military analyst B.H. Liddell Hart. For years, they questioned captured German generals regarding their true evaluations of the Allied leadership. The insights those generals provided were far more nuanced than the legends they had publicly peddled. Of all the Allied commanders, only one elicited genuine scorn from the German hierarchy. Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army in Italy, was the object of their disdain. Tall and cinematic in appearance, Clark was consumed by his public image, maintaining a personal public relations staff and positioning photographers to capture his most flattering angles. He was convinced of his own destiny for greatness, a sentiment not shared by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded the opposing German forces in Italy. Following the war, Kesselring offered an assessment of Clark that dripped with barely veiled contempt. Kesselring explained to interrogators that Clark was predictable precisely because of his vanity. He would invariably select the course of action that garnered the most sensational headlines. For Clark, military strategy took a backseat to publicity, a fact that was starkly proven at Anzio in May of 1944. Clark's forces had successfully broken out of the beachhead, leaving the German 10th Army retreating northward, exposed and defenseless. Clark possessed a golden opportunity to encircle and annihilate an entire German army, yet he instead diverted his forces toward Rome. Driven by a desire to be hailed as the liberator of the first Axis capital, he sought the photographs, the headlines, and the personal glory. He allowed the German 10th Army to slip away and fight another day, a decision that carried a tragic price. While Clark struck poses for cameras in the Colosseum, American infantrymen were left to die in the mud of northern Italy. They were engaging the very same German units Clark had failed to entrap. The photographs were magnificent, but the cost was paid in blood. General Siegfried Westphal Kesselring's chief of staff regarded Clark as one of the greatest assets the German forces possessed in the Italian theatre. This was not due to his tactical brilliance, but rather because his narcissism rendered him entirely predictable. When one understood that Clark craved glory more than victory, one could anticipate his every move with absolute certainty. If Clark was predictable due to vanity, Bernard Montgomery was predictable due to his extreme caution. Montgomery commanded the British 21st Army Group. As the victor over Rommel at El Alamein, he was celebrated as Britain's paramount military hero. Consequently, German generals could set their watches by his movements. Rundstedt's assessment was clinical, noting that Montgomery was exceedingly systematic. He maintained a doctrine of never launching an offensive until he had amassed an insurmountable advantage, a strategy that proved effective only when time and resources were in abundant supply. However, this predictability served as a clear signal to the German High Command, alerting them well in advance of any impending assault. During his interrogation, General Gunther Blumentritt, Rundstedt's chief of staff, vividly enacted Montgomery's operational methodology. Rising from his chair, he traversed the room with measured, ponderous strides, placing each foot with meticulous deliberation. Devoid of spontaneity or risk, this gate Blumentritt explained mirrored Montgomery's tactical maneuvering. His formula was an open book to them, necessitating a minimum ratio of 2 to 1. He demanded a 2 to 1 superiority in infantry and a staggering 4 to 1 advantage in armor, invariably preceded by a multi-day artillery barrage. The enemy anticipated his nightly halts to secure positions, rather than exploiting the momentum, rendering him vulnerable not to brute strength but to swift agility. Provided one could maneuver units with greater alacrity than Montgomery's laborious preparations allowed, maintaining the initiative was all but guaranteed. Only once during Operation Market Garden did the Field Marshal cast his legendary prudence to the wind. Wagering heavily on a daring airborne seizure of Rhine crossings, he displayed a level of audacity and aggression entirely foreign to his usual character. The result was an unmitigated disaster costing the Allied forces 17,000 casualties. The British 1st Airborne Division was effectively obliterated by the German defence, a grim reality for the Allied paratroopers left isolated at Arnhem. It unfolded as a complete nightmare. The troops were deployed one bridge beyond their reach, offering up their lives on the altar of a typically prudent commander, attempting to feign audacity. The German leadership did not fail to observe the profound irony of the situation. In his solitary attempt to emulate the aggression of Patton, Montgomery merely demonstrated the wisdom of his usual restraint. Yet not every British officer was viewed with such disparagement. Harold Alexander, at the helm of the 15th Army Group in Italy, presented a striking counterpoint. Though technically Montgomery's superior in the Mediterranean theatre, Alexander displayed a fluidity that contrasted sharply with Montgomery's rigidity. He chose to facilitate rather than dominate. Kesselring regarded Alexander with sincere esteem, bestowing upon him the title of gentleman, a designation intended as the ultimate professional accolade. Alexander led what Kesselring characterized as a heterogeneous mongrel force. His ranks were comprised of Americans, British Canadians, Free French Poles, Indians, Brazilians, and New Zealanders. A myriad of nationalities, each wielding distinct weaponry, adhering to unique doctrines, and speaking diverse tongues. Unifying such a disparate coalition demanded a level of diplomatic finesse that was entirely absent in Montgomery's repertoire. Kesselring noted that Alexander possessed a profound grasp of the intricacies involved in coalition warfare. Rather than imposing a singular methodology, he skillfully leveraged the unique strengths of each contingent while mitigating discord among the Allies. This adaptability rendered Alexander far more elusive and unpredictable than Montgomery, as he was not bound by dogmatic adherence to a single tactical philosophy. Clear as throat. He molded his strategy to fit the situation, granting his subordinates the latitude to exercise their own judgment and initiative. In the eyes of the German High Command, Alexander represented the potential Montgomery might have realized had he been endowed with a measure of humility. He was a British leader who commanded admiration through adaptability rather than exacting submission through arrogance. This distinction was intentionally highlighted in German evaluations. When questioned regarding British leadership, the generals consistently lauded Alexander while critiquing Montgomery. Such mutual esteem was an exceptional rarity amidst the savage brutality of the Second World War. It marked a fleeting instance where adversaries gazed across the trenches and recognized a mirror image of their own professional ethos. While they sought the destruction of Alexander's forces, they would figuratively salute the man at the helm. The sentiment was unmistakable. Germany's adversaries were not viewed through a monolithic lens. Certain Allied commanders garnered authentic professional reverence. Conversely, others failed to impress. Dwight Eisenhower served as the supreme Allied commander. Despite wielding a military might unprecedented in history, the German generals scarcely regarded him as a general in the traditional sense, a sentiment bluntly summarized by Rundstedt. Eisenhower was perceived as a coordinator rather than a battlefield commander, a political administrator managing an alliance rather than a soldier with an intrinsic grasp of combat. The German leadership acknowledged the formidable challenge involved in maintaining the cohesion of the Allied coalition. The Americans and British harbored diverging strategic ambitions, while the Free French forces introduced their own web of political complexities. Harmonizing air, land, and naval operations across various theaters of war necessitated a brilliance in organization. While Eisenhower undoubtedly possessed that administrative acumen in the German view, he was devoid of the killer instinct essential for warfare. Von Manteuffel expressed to his interrogators that Eisenhower's adherence to the broad front strategy was fundamentally flawed. Rather than massing overwhelming power at a critical juncture, Eisenhower pushed forward along the entire line, simultaneously thereby precluding any decisive rupture of the defenses. Rundstedt concurred, arguing that the optimal Allied course would have been to amass a potent strike force to punch through past Aachen toward the Ruhr. A penetration of that magnitude would have shredded the fragile German defensive line and potentially concluded the conflict by the autumn of 1944. Instead, Eisenhower diluted his strength across the front. He ensured a uniform advance to appease all parties, yet in doing so, he effectively granted Germany an additional 6 months of resistance. To the German High Command, Eisenhower seemed less like a battlefield commander and more like a statesman navigating a complex electorate. He appeared incapable of showing preference among his lieutenants or accepting the harsh reality that military efficacy often demands the sparks of political discord. While he excelled at maintaining harmony within the boardroom, he consistently hesitated to deliver the decisive coup de grace. Omar Bradley stood at the helm of the 12th Army Group, guiding a colossal force exceeding 1 million souls across the European theatre. Clear his throat. The Wehrmacht leadership found him an enigma largely because he remained so persistently inconspicuous. He shunned the limelight sought by Clark, rejected the theatrical flair of Patton, and avoided the vanity that defined Montgomery. He simply governed his forces. Rundstedt characterized him as capable and relentlessly systematic. From a Prussian field marshal, such words constitute significant respect, yet they lack the fire of true awe. Bradley was viewed as a consummate professional, a pillar of reliability. He embodied the quintessential American officer, a quality that rendered him formidable in a manner quite distinct from his flamboyant peers. Clear his throat. Bradley eschewed reckless gambits, yet committed no blunders, preferring to exert a constant crushing weight until the enemy line inevitably fractured. German strategists observed that his command style was a direct reflection of America's vast industrial might. Brilliance was unnecessary when one possessed such inexhaustible assets. His mandate was merely to deploy this abundance effectively and avoid ruinous missteps. And Bradley executed this duty with distinction from the breakout at Saint-Lô and the dash across France to the countermeasure against the Ardennes offensive. Every maneuver was executed with professional competence, yet the German General Staff did not dread Bradley with the visceral intensity reserved for other adversaries. They accorded him the esteem due a skilled practitioner, but his name did not haunt their restless nights. Courtney Hodges led the First Army, engaging a greater number of German troops than perhaps any other Allied leader. It is a peculiar paradox of American strength that most enemy commanders could scarcely recall his name, despite spending years locked in combat with his legions. They suffered heavy casualties against his forces at Normandy, shattered their formations at Aachen, and perished in the grim depths of the Hurtgen forest. Yet when pressed by interrogators to characterize Hodges personally, German officers found themselves at a loss for words. Their memories was of the collective rather than the man. Von Manteuffel offered a telling description, likening the American advance to a relentless, impersonal machine. The individual architect mattered little compared to the apparatus itself. The First Army possessed a seemingly infinite supply of munitions. They enjoyed total dominance of the skies, along with an endless stream of replacement vehicles, equipment, and personnel. If a battalion were annihilated, a fresh unit would instantly materialize to fill the void. For years, the German military elite had scrutinized opposing leaders seeking personal flaws to leverage in battle. However, against such a mechanized juggernaut, human frailty became irrelevant. Clear his throat. One cannot dismantle a factory simply by eliminating the floor manager. This realization instilled a unique sense of hopelessness along the German front. A human opponent may be outwitted. A general may be deceived, but one cannot outmaneuver a tidal wave of steel. Facing the First Army was never a contest of intellect. It resembled an execution by artillery fire, a prospect far more terrifying than any solitary commander, however dangerous Patton might have been. Montgomery might have been predictable and Hodges merely competent, but the American industrial complex was an inescapable force of nature. Such a colossal engine required no stroke of genius to operate only capable administration. The Wehrmacht learned to dread the nameless storm, and then there was George Patton. Prior to the Normandy landings, German intelligence had largely disregarded him failing to build a profile or track his movements, assuming the slapping incident had permanently ended his career. Snorts, they were violently disabused of this notion in August of 1944. When Patton's Third Army burst forth from Normandy, covering 400 miles in a mere fortnight, German commanders viewed the situation reports with utter incredulity. No military force travelled with such velocity. Tactical maps were rendered useless within hours, prompting an immediate reassessment by Rundstedt. Patton was your very best, he confessed to American interrogators following the cessation of hostilities. He did not say one of the best, but simply the best, while Jodl drew a comparison to Guderian, the architect of German armoured doctrine. Patton was audacious, favouring sweeping manoeuvres and thinking in terms of grand operational strategy rather than the slow grind of tactical attrition. Kesselring remarked that Patton had elevated armoured warfare to an art form, drawing a parallel to the desert fox himself, Rommel. Coming from a field marshal who had engaged both commanders, this was the ultimate accolade. Byerline, a veteran of Rommel's African campaign, provided the most insightful observation. While other Allied leaders might permit encircled German units to slip away, Patton was different. Byerline noted grimly that he did not believe Patton would grant them such an easy reprieve. The Battle of the Bulge fundamentally altered their perspective. German strategists had estimated the Americans would require 2 weeks to counter the Ardennes offensive. Instead, Patton pivoted 3 entire divisions 90 degrees and launched a counterattack within 48 hours. Von Manteuffel stared at the intelligence in disbelief, unable to fathom how a full army could traverse 100 miles through a blizzard in just 2 days. Envision the sheer consternation within the German command bunker. Their charts promised safety, and their calculations assured them of ample time. Yet piercing through the winter mist and snowfall, the thunderous roar of thousands of Sherman engines shattered the silence they had counted on. This was far more than a simple tactical shift. It was a seismic jolt to their entire operation, ensuring the German High Command would never again take General Patton lightly. They had learned a hard lesson about the folly of mistaking a true gladiator for a mere foot soldier. However, Patton stood not alone in striking terror into the hearts of the German leadership. Lucian Truscott, though less celebrated, was equally formidable. He did not lead an entire army group, nor did his likeness grace the covers of glossy magazines or the silver screens of Hollywood. Yet the German generals in Italy harboured a fear of him, rivaled only by their dread of Patton, particularly after Truscott assumed control of the 6th Corps at Anzio in February of 1944. Under General John Lucas, the beachhead had languished for weeks, allowing the German forces to contain the advance and slowly wear down the American resolve. Mere days after Truscott assumed command, General Westphal observed a palpable shift in the atmosphere. He conveyed to Kesselring that the American manoeuvres had abruptly gained a new resolve. Units once dormant were now displaying a fierce aggression. Positions that had previously remained motionless were now actively testing the lines, with the sole variable being the change in leadership. Truscott instilled a rigorous discipline famously dubbed the Truscott Trot, training his troops to march at a pace that far exceeded the conventional military doctrine. They struck before the defense could brace itself and capitalized on vulnerabilities before the enemy could respond, maintaining a tempo that blistered feet and tested the limits of endurance. Yet Truscott pushed them relentlessly, driven by his understanding of the cold, unyielding calculus of warfare. He operated on the principle that perspiration spares bloodshed. To outpace the enemy's thought process is to secure victory, while hesitation invites destruction. The German commanders identified this approach as a display of genuine tactical brilliance. While Truscott remained obscure due to his lack of desire for acclaim, he was exceedingly dangerous, possessing a grasp of mobile warfare that mirrored Patton's own intuition. In the post-war analysis, when German generals enumerated the Allied leaders who had truly disquieted them, Truscott's name was listed right beside Patton's. It was not Montgomery, Bradley, or Clark who garnered such respect. The professionals recognized one of their own, seeing Truscott as the concealed dagger the public never knew to dread. The German hierarchy evaluated Allied commanders based on a singularly straightforward criterion. The question was simply who disturbed their slumber. Whereas Clark offered them openings and Montgomery granted them time, others were not so generous. Eisenhower inadvertently extended the conflict by 6 months, while Bradley and Hodges delivered a crushing, inescapable demise. Alexander commanded their professional respect. Truscott incited their fear, and Patton, quite notably, earned both. These assessments were not judgments of character or leadership quality, but rather an appraisal of who posed the most lethal threat, a measure upon which the German generals were unequivocal. They understood that velocity and aggression were fatal, whereas predictability was their saving grace. Ultimately, the German ranking of Allied commanders reveals less about the American forces and more about the qualities the German military had forfeited. They revered the old-world professionalism of Truscott and Alexander because it offered a reflection of their own former glory. However, they dreaded the industrial might of Hodges and the rapid pace of Patton, for in them, they glimpsed the inevitable future. And in that unfolding future, there remained no sanctuary for the Wehrmacht.